What's going on, everybody? We're going to do another Tales from the Video Store episode, and today, besides doing the countdowns like we've been doing, I figure I'd change it up and go ahead and actually tell a pretty good story from the video store. This one has to do, if you can tell by the title, the Ashtray Urinal, or Urinal Ashtray, whichever way I'm going to put it on there. Yeah, it has something to do about a weird customer relieving himself, in the middle of the day, somewhere he shouldn't have been. But we'll get to that story here in a little bit. I guess it would be funny now, but I can remember at the time, because I was actually there behind the counter when this transpired, and it was kind of an event, because seeing my dad get, worked up and mad. But anyway, I'm jumping ahead. I'm going to talk about a few movies that I really like from 85. We just did the top 1985 VHS rental countdowns, which, I pull them sources from the internet, or, some kind of, little books and magazines video stores used to get, which, by the way, I know I talked about trying to find some old video store stuff, and I was going through a box, and I did happen to come upon this right here. It's a Thorn EMI video catalog from spring summer 1983, VHS and beta. So we'll go through this in a future video, go through it and see what was in it. It don't really have the prices in it. This is kind of like, hey, here's what we're going to be selling you. Try to get some of this stuff up close. Pretty cool. So, but yeah, we'll go through this in the future. I also did pick up a VHS the other day. Got this, Troma's War from Media Home Entertainment and Troma. Actually, I've never watched this. Looks Troma-ish, so I'm gonna check it out here sometime soon. And I also picked up a copy of Prom Night 2 on DVD. MGM release. I believe this is getting ready to be re-released by the company that re-released Trick or Treat, Sammy Kerr, Fastway, Skippy is in it, so I'm looking forward to that. I'll pick it up when it comes out. So I'm going to get back to some of these movies from 1985 that I used to watch quite a bit. I'm going to start it off with Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. I kind of relate to this movie, but not the way everybody's, knows about this movie now. I used to watch this all the time as a kid. And, the opening sequence with the school bus, where the kids are on the bus and it, drives off into the Grand Canyon or whatever, it's what it looks like to me, and gets stuck on that rock, and here comes Freddy, kind of relate to that as a kid, riding the bus to school, taking field trips. And also at this time, around Halloween, there was a haunted, I wouldn't call it a haunted house, but they actually had Freddy's bus. You could pay and go sit on the bus, and Freddy would walk up and down the walkway. My dad took me to it, and I remember being so scared, like, Freddy's going to stop at our seat. Looking back on it, what a cash grab, He just had to walk up back and forth like 2 or 3 times, and everybody hopped off the back. There was some steps. So, cool for its time, but looking back on it, it's like the person who put that together, man, that had been some easy money. So, another reason why I was talking about I relate to this movie, the people move into that house, it's a new house to them. At this time, we also moved into a new house. Movie store had been making pretty good money at that time, because, this is mid-80s, and I can remember sitting there and my parents counting up the money from the day, be like, oh, $300, $400, $500 a day, and put it in that little zipper pouch and drop it off at the overnight, door at the bank. So, you do that every single day. That was more money than I think my parents had before, because I can remember being younger, and we was living in like a duplex. And then all of a sudden we're in this, big, 2-story house, basement and everything. So, the school bus, they're moving into a new house. Another thing that I remember about it was the coach. He would go on to be in one of my favorite movies, and I can't wait to get to where we get into the 90s. The movie Airheads with Brendan Fraser and Adam Sandler. I love that movie. I still watch that, whenever I can. I still have it on DVD because I know it's not really streaming on anything anymore. It used to be on Max or something, because I can remember watching it streaming, and then now it's not. It's one of those, it's out of print, and people try and sell the DVD for $15 or whatever. But I still see that DVD at, like, thrift market, flea market type places, for $1. So it's out there. If you just got to go find it. I know the Blu-ray of it, though, is extremely expensive. It came out one time. It's either by itself or it's like a double feature with some other movie on Blu-ray. And I can remember when Walmart had it, and I was like, well, they want $24 or whatever for it. I'll wait for it to be cheap. But, that's a curse of being a physical collector. You'll pass up stuff thinking it's going to get re-released, or, something, a better version of it will come out, and, then it doesn't. And it's like, oh man, I gotta go find, my old DVD. But, back to Nightmare on Elm Street 2, I thought it was weird, even when I was little, because I didn't watch this maybe when I was 5, but I did watch it when I was real young, because I can remember going to, my dad take me to the movie theater to see Dream Warriors. So, my dad was cool in certain aspects, but I wouldn't have took my kids to see, Nightmare on Elm Street, when they were 7 or 8 years old, like I was. But I remember watching it, and that boy's dancing around his room to, to me, it was like girl music, and he's like popping that popper, jumping off his bed. I was like, man, I'd be embarrassed if that was me. But, that movie's went on to, I guess, I don't know how to, I guess how to say it the right way, I guess the director or something, and I believe that main actor, they're gay and stuff, which, that's all right. But some of that stuff really shows now, because when I was little, you're not thinking of stuff like that. I'm like, man, he's at the bar and he's in high school and the coach is there dressed like Judas Priest, or, it's like he makes him run and he's getting whipped, or I don't know. I always thought, man, that's a, little Blue Oyster Bar-ish to me, referencing our police academy. But anyway, and I remember the video box, Freddy's, the box has that, like, looks like it's ripped and he's peeking around, with the glove holding the side, which I know later on the DVD releases has all those, and the laser discs have those really cool painted covers. It looks like, Nightmare on Elm Street, 1 and 3, and some of them other ones. But, in the video store days, like Nightmare on Elm Street 4, I'm trying to think of how that box looked. And I know the one we had, Nightmare on Elm Street 5, had Freddy, doing the shush by the stroller. And I talked about that big old cardboard standee we had. But he's doing that shush. And I guess that VHS was unrated all this time, because I can remember getting the DVD and I'm like, man, there's something missing from this one. It's missing all kinds of stuff. To me, I thought it was missing a whole bunch. Come to find out that VHS was unrated this whole time. And then, here recently, I know the 4K Nightmare on Elm Street set come out and it's unrated on there finally, which, that's cool. With the merger of Netflix and HBO Max coming, a lot of people are worried about Nightmare on Elm Street, the license and franchise. That's pretty much the end of physical media for, you're just going to be able to stream it whenever they put it up, which, it could be true, but that box set's out there. All I can say is get that 4K box set. I know there's a big cool steelbook version of it, which I did not buy. I didn't pre-order it. There is this little slim version of it that's, it's kind of case and all the DVDs. That's what I got. But you can still find, and because that box set come out, everybody's been getting rid of the original DVD box set, where Freddy's in that trench coat or whatever. I saw it at one of our disc replays in the area, and it was only $20, $24.99 used. So, you're out and about, you can probably find that set, which is, just as fine. It's got that Nightmare and Encyclopedia in it. I always, thought that was real cool in the book. So, but moving on from A Nightmare on Elm Street, Day of the Dead come out in 1985. This would be probably my intro to loving gore. Maybe not. Maybe I'm saying it too much. Like I love it, but I can remember when them guys are getting torn apart. Their stomachs and their heads and stuff. It's like, man, this is so realistic looking. This is scary but awesome at the same time. The beginning of it with the helicopter and that dude missing the bottom of his jaw walking around and that alligator slithering around. I thought all the army guys were cool except for the main guy. It was pretty extreme for a younger person to be watching. And we had that, I guess, HBO or Thorn or somebody put it out. Had Bub on the front. I always thought that doctor in it was the owner of Mr. Ed, that Richard Liberty. I guess I'm wrong. I don't know who Mr. Ed's owner was in the show, but I thought them two guys, his voice sounded just like Mr. Ed's owner from that old show, Mr. Ed. We'll talk about Day of the Dead a lot more in the future because I am a huge George Romero fan. Dawn of the Dead is probably my top 5 movies, so we will get into some of that stuff as time goes on with these videos. Return of the Living Dead also come out in 1985. I watched that. If you can't tell, I'm going to try to change these backgrounds up or try to get a permanent one. I'm winging it. I'm just putting stuff up behind me as I go because I've got, I don't know, hundreds of posters in those little tubes from a UPS store up in my storage, because I don't have them up in my house, I don't think my wife would like our nice house having, Halloween, Curse of Michael Myers, or Dawn of the Dead posters up, or Transformers, or or I've got some, and they're not original, got like Rad, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. I bought that stuff throughout time, and I've saved them. The corners might not be the best, but I still have them. I'll probably be throwing them up behind me until I change this office into a complete, YouTube studio. I need to get a mic, some lights and stuff. I'm just using stuff I got around the house right now until I build some stuff or get some time to make this more professional. But like I was saying, Return of the Living Dead come out. I know the first thing everybody thinks is trash, dancing, all completely naked on the tombstones. Which, when I was younger, when it'd come on, I'd be like, oh, I got to fast forward this or kind of look down in case, my mom or somebody's going to stroll in and be like, well, I didn't know that was in here, even though I've watched it, multiple times. I always thought they were all cool looking, that old car, that convertible, with the spray paint was always cool. But what stood out to me would probably be the music. That Grave 45, It's Party Time, all the little punk music that's in it. I liked all that, and it took forever for me to find them songs or get the soundtrack on vinyl, and I actually come across a cassette tape of the soundtrack at a Goodwill like 6 years ago. That and Trick or Treat. Speaking of Trick or Treat, somebody got rid of their stuff, and I'm walking by looking like, man, look, here's these cassettes. I couldn't believe they were in there together for $1 a piece or whatever. So, I still got that old cassette, but it didn't sound really good. I put it in a, boom box, and it was kind of, a little slow and dragging. You could tell it was a loved cassette, but it had the cover and everything, which I'll pull that stuff out and show on here, do a show and tell maybe, or do a deep dive on all the Return of the Living Deads and start pulling some stuff out that I got. And also in Return of the Living Dead, you got them zombies, send more paramedics, they're talking, they're running. I know a lot of people cite Dawn of the Dead 2004 as the first time there were fast zombies, but they were running in Return of the Living Dead. I do remember that because they bum rushed the police. That cop had that pistol handled 12 gauge or whatever, and made that big boom, but they still got him. There's the little person zombie, and Freddy dying, and has that bad ending, where they just drop a bomb on Louisville, so. But, Return of the Living Dead is one of my favorites. I got the Steelbook, I got a Blu-ray, I got the 4K. I'm probably going to get rid of my Blu-ray, but you know, it's a fun movie to go back and watch. You know, I like all the special features on all the different releases, you know. And my heart's still fond of, you know, the original DVD because it has that original artwork from the VHS, which I know a guy that has that VHS still sealed, you know, and he's not a movie buff, but he won't sell it to me. You know, he likes to, hey man, check out that tape I got, you know, because he has like rental properties and somebody left all their stuff and that was like something they left, which is crazy. You know, like to hook up with that guy, you know, well, who had a sealed Return of the Living Dead, you know, VHS from back in the day still, you know. But in another movie that came out in 1985, Cat's Eye, Stephen King's Cat's Eye. That's a fun movie. You know, I let my kids watch that, you know, kind of young if they wanted to, which, you know, my daughter loves horror movies, but, you know, my boys don't like watching horror movies. My other daughter doesn't like horror movies. They, you know, it's not their thing, you know, it's not in their DNA like it is me. But Cat's Eye was cool. The guy walking on the ledge, you know, and the pigeons are poking at his feet, and he's got to walk around it, and that guy's like, you know, spraying him with a fire extinguisher or shooting at him or throwing fire, whatever it was. You know, I haven't watched it in a while. And the little gremlin guy that's, you know, suffocating the girl, and then the cat, you know, saves her and knocks him into the fan. But I do remember some of those effects holding up, like especially that little, you know, little green dude. He's running around. I don't remember it looking real superimposed or, you know, like he's, you know, chopped in. I don't know if they had some sets with oversized furniture sitting in it or whatever, but you know, Cat's Eye is pretty cool, you know, little anthology type thing. So, you know, and Stephen King also, you know, coming up pretty soon, you know, Maximum Overdrive is another one of my favorites. You know, we'll talk about that when it gets to time to talk about it. Anyway, that's probably the few movies I wanted to mention from 1985 because I didn't want to shoehorn them into the, you know, top countdown from 85 with the popular movies, you know, that, you know, were out for rent. But, you know, these movies right here, they made just as much money throughout time, you know. Even back then, there was guys that come in and rent, you know, Return of the Living Dead or Day of the Dead all the time, you know. It'd be in for a little bit and go out every day, you know, $2 a hit, you know. I have to look it up, you know. I'm sure these movies were, you know, $79.99 or whatever, but, you know, movies $80, you know. It could have been a little bit more, but like I said, you know, it's $80, $90. And back in, you know, a new release would rent for, you know, I guess $3 or $4. I had to, you know, try to find some old books or receipts my parents might have had. You know, they, at that time, you know, at the end of the day, there'd be a super long receipt, you know, and they'd clip it and do their own taxes and stuff. They had an office in their house. Some of that stuff's still around. I can find it. But like I said, I think they were released for $3 or $4. Probably $3, because even $4 back then was probably steep. But you know, you do the math and see how many times it takes something to rent to make, you know, get $80, and then after that it's profit every single time it rents. So, you know, video games and adult movies are expensive or were expensive, even though video games have kind of stayed the same forever. You know, we look at old KB toy ads and stuff, and you'll see, you know, pro wrestling or Zelda or Metroid, you know, and you see it was, you know, $50 back then, $60. You know, in the 2000s, you know, I was a gamer until probably PlayStation 3 was probably the end of my run, you know, before I became, you know, just an adult, you know, had other stuff to do. I don't have time to sit around and, you know, play video games like my kids do. But even then, you know, Xbox, GameCube, PlayStation 2, you know, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, games are still, you know, $50, $60. So they've kind of stayed the same, kind of like pizza. You know, I'll see old commercials for pizza, and I'm like, man, this was $20 back then. It's $20 kind of still, you know. But I guess we're going to move on to the main part of this video, which would be a tale from the video store, the Ashtray Urinal. I can remember it was summertime because I wasn't in school and I wanted to go hang out with my dad. So I'm behind the counter, and this, you know, this ain't 85. This is just, a Nintendo was out, you know, because I remember sitting behind the counter with the old tube TV on like a little stand with rollers, and I'd sit back here and play video games with the volume all the way down because, you know, they don't want to hear all that beeping and booping and, you know, 8-bit music while they were trying to work. So we're staying, I'm sitting there, my dad's at the counter. There's nobody in there except for one guy on the way out. So we're sitting there, and my dad, he kind of looks down at me. He says, "You hear that?" And I pause the game, and I'm sitting there. Of course, I didn't hear nothing, or my ears weren't in tune to what I was supposed to be hearing. So I'm like, I don't really hear nothing. So my dad steps around the counter. And when you walked in the video store, I probably need to do a layout for everybody to have a mental image sometime of our video store, the first one, because we ended up having more than one at one time. You'd walk in the front door, and there's the desk on the left. All the movies were behind the desk. This is back when the box would be on the shelf, and there's a tag. And my mom would use a typewriter or electric typewriter, type the number and the title on a big old piece of cardboard, and use one of those cutting boards, where you slide the paper through, and it's got the big, I can't think of the proper name for it right now, but that old sword knife thing inside, and she'd cut them all up, make sure they're all the same size, and had that little strip in front of on the shelf in front of the box, and they would slide that little tag right there, and you'd walk it up to the counter, and they'd walk back and pull the movie out. And when you was renting an adult movie, those tags were red. So anybody walking up with a red tag was, renting an X-rated movie. And the clamshell, because back then it wasn't those clear ones where you could just look at the tape through the clear plastic. It was those black and brown ones with the little slip in the middle, and you hand wrote, the title of the movie, and then on the side of the case would be a little circle sticker with the number of what matched the ticket. And of course, the boxes for X-rated movies were also like a cherry color, so there was no sneaking in to, rent an adult movie. Because when I'm little, I'd be like, man, I'd be embarrassed to walk up there and get one of those dirty movies. Why can't they just be the same color as everything else? But, anyway, that's how they did it. So, anyway, my dad steps around the counter, and we're in the front part where the new releases were, in front of the counter, kind of. And then it went back into another room. Then it went to the left, and there was another room. And then, there's an X-rated room. It had a door, that you just walked into. And it was kind of a, catacomb. It went pretty far back. This was almost like the building was, I don't want to say a duplex, but there was a big garage door in the middle where the landlord kept one of his cool cars. It was like a red Cadillac, like a 50s Cadillac convertible. And it always sat there all the time. And one side, the left side was like a hair salon, which that woman ended up working for us for a while. And then on the right side was my parents' video store. And, it kind of went real far back, this building. So my dad kind of steps in the middle of the front room to the doorway, and he's standing there. And I'm like, I wonder what's going on. So then my dad walks to the back. I'm still sitting in the front, I'm like, well, I'm going to keep playing my video game, whatever I was playing. I'm sitting on the ground, crisscross-legged, and all of a sudden I hear some, hollering, or, my dad talking loud, which, I paused the game like, what's going on? Now I'm trying to listen because my dad's hollering. Next thing I know, he's dragging this guy through the doorway. Now it's summertime, and I remember this guy, he had a sock cap on, he had a beard, his hair was long, he was wearing like a green-looking, army-looking jacket, and it's hot, and this guy's dressed like it's wintertime, so I don't know. But anyway, my dad is moving him to the front door. He opens up the front door and pushes him out. Now, my dad was kind of a roughneck. To kind of explain my dad, he already had false teeth, like his front 4 or 5 or 6 teeth were false because they got knocked out in a fight at a pool hall one time, before I was born. His stomach had a big scar up the middle where somebody stabbed him and ripped it up. I don't know all them stories to heart because, he died before I could ever really talk to him, man to man, like, hey, what? But I've heard stories from my mom or, my uncles, so, my dad's a little wild, which will play into a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about in the future. But he grabbed this guy and just slammed him through the front door, and this guy falls down out the front because I'm looking out the window. There were posters in the windows, but it didn't cover the whole window, so I'm looking out, one of the little cracks, looking at this guy. And he gets up and he's, hollering back, cussing or whatever. And we had that vending machine out front, so he like starts kicking the vending machine like he's trying to bust the front of it or whatever. So my dad walks back to the room I guess he was in. Now, back in the 80s, people smoked everywhere. So in our video store, in a couple of them rooms, were these tall ashtrays. They were tan on the side and silver on top, where you could pull the silver top off. There's like a tall rectangle column or whatever. And you can put a trash bag or something in there, but really it was just the top part was for the ashes. Well, apparently this guy walked in there, took the top off, and just took a big leak. So my dad heard this and walked up on him while he was relieving himself, and of course was extremely mad. I threw him out. So this guy's still up front trying to, be mad because he got caught, peeing in the store into an ashtray. So my dad comes walking through there, and he's got the ashtray in his hand. He goes out the front door and he sloshes the pee on the guy, it gets on his pants or whatever. And this guy tries to get irate. And I remember my dad, he came back in, and I've talked about the late charge collector bat that was behind the counter, up on the wall. He grabs that bat and he walks out there, he's like, yeah, I'm going to bash your head in if you don't get out of here right now. Don't ever come back. I was scared because I'm young. I don't want to see my dad fighting, you're a kid. I didn't think, oh, Dad's tough and it's cool. I'm scared. Like, oh no, don't beat this guy down or don't get hurt. You don't know, when you're a kid, you love your parents. You don't know what's going to happen. So, but, yeah, that guy went off. My dad come in. He's mad. He's cussing and stuff. And he's like, I can't believe this guy was in there. And he said, he was using cuss words for everything. And he went out to the side. There was an alley beside the video store, and he's spraying out this trash can, and washing out or whatever, letting air out, And I can just remember him being irate, which I makes sense. You don't want somebody coming into your place of business and just, using a bathroom in the middle of one of your rooms. But that would go on. We'd have all kinds, that's part of, I guess, being in, what was it, customer service or whatever you want to call it, working with the public. You got to deal with weirdos all the time. He wasn't the only weird customer. There was a guy that he used to ride a bicycle. He drove a Corvette. It was a real cool, bright yellow convertible Corvette. But man, this guy looked like he had been, hit in the head with a cannonball. He kind of looked like somebody from Nightbreed or something. And he had like a skullet. He was pretty bald on top. And, had some stringy hair on the sides. But he had this brand new, cool, Corvette. And he'd come in, and he couldn't even talk. He would just like go, So I don't even know how he filled out an application to become a member of the video store, But and he would rent adult movies like, he'd get like 3 at a time and be like back every other day. So my parents were making money hand over fist off this guy, and this is before your debit card days. It was cash or nothing. So everybody come in, it was cash, and this guy was just renting these adult movies and burning through them every single night, so I got some other customers I can talk about. There were some regulars that were, my parents knew some bad things about some people. They'd be like, oh yeah, that guy, he went to jail for kidnapping a kid or something, and he got out of it or something, or this guy was in jail for selling crack or something. He's he got out of jail and he's in here renting movies. These guys will just talk about stuff because a customer comes in, you kind of try to talk to them, be nice. And some customers, man, they will tell you their whole life story. I can remember sitting there, one ear perk up, be like, what that guy say? Or another one be like, and then I try to ask my parents, what's that mean? Or, what, some of the bad stuff they might have been talking about, like, oh, don't worry about it. You don't need to worry about that. Just go back to, reading your comic book or whatever. So, But yeah, I'll have some stories about some some customers, and I guess I can go into maybe a no. I'm gonna save it for another video. I'm gonna talk about my uncle's video store next time. To kind of give you a layout of that video store, it started out as like a little double wide trailer type building. And the more movies he got, he would just knock a wall out and add like a metal building that you get at Lowe's, or like a sturdy building. And it just kept on connecting to where it had this like weird Lego palace looking thing going on. It's like, man, maybe you should just move to a different spot. But he was adamant about location, location, which is true. He had it on a pretty good part of the town they lived in. I don't disclose kind of the area I'm talking about, because everybody's got everybody lived through the mom and pop small video store era. Every town's kind of the same, so I try not to pigeonhole is what area I'm in or what area it was in, because I don't live in that area anymore. But it's probably the same everywhere. If you got some weird stories about your video store you went to, drop it in the comments. Let's talk about it. Because I want to hear other people's stories too. I can't be the one that had some weird stuff go on. I'm sure everybody saw cool stuff or weird stuff, or maybe something they wasn't supposed to see at the video store. I'll throw in another story. I remember I kind of drop about the adult movies a lot. I can remember one time my mom being upset. I don't know if she's upset, but she was shocked. There was a customer who accidentally put his personal home video in one of the clamshells and returned it. And he had to come back in, and he's like, yeah, I just returned whatever it was. He's like, I gave you the wrong tape. And sometimes when people return movies, they just open it up and look, see if it's the right movie, and they're real fast. So my mom knew exactly what tape this was. I don't know if they watched it or she watched it, but she's like, yeah, we got this right here. We was waiting for you to come back in. And, she pulls out his, Maxwell or, Sony, SP or, gold labeled, home, blank tape. It's like, here you go. And he turned in the tape he was supposed to turn in. And my mom telling my dad that, well, this guy had his own adult situations on this tape and turned it in by accident, which, was it an accident or was it on purpose? Because, I don't know. If I was making something like that back then, I probably wouldn't just be, leaving it in a stack of movies maybe. I'd kind of be like, well, I need to put this up, or, put it in a safe, or, not just throw it in, another, adult movie I rented and, oops, I returned my home movie of myself, to the video store. I'd be embarrassed. But, there's a lot of people, they didn't have any shame at all. So, but anyway, like I said, that's probably going to be it for this video. It's going to be a little shorter. I just wanted to touch upon a few movies I watched quite a bit back then, and talk about the guy relieving himself in the ashtray that's that was in the video store. I've got quite a few of these type of stories, so I'll pull some more out here before long, or weave them into the countdowns or the stuff we're going to talk about, because we're getting ready to hit 1986, and I know in 86 and especially 87 there's going to be a lot of stuff that I still watch to today, or is like in my top 5 movies or top 10 movies of my personal opinion that I just love. So I'll be able to talk about them quite a bit more than we did the 1984 list and the 1985 list of the the commercial popular movies. And I still haven't gotten around to watching The Natural yet. I've been busy these last couple days, but I do plan on watching that Robert Redford movie, The Natural. And in 1984, I'm trying to remember some of the movies we talked about in that one, where I was like, well, yeah, no, I do remember. I'm probably never going to be watching Tootsie or Flashdance or Staying Alive. I don't see them in my future. if they're your favorite movies, you can drop in the comments what you really like about them, or if you was around at that time, a little older than me, because I was still a child. So that's why I don't have a lot of history with that, and also when you're that young, your mind's kind of mush, you're not, what's those little memes they make where, oh, I was 6 years old and all of a sudden I start remembering my life, like when you're little, you're just kind of in a dream state and all of a sudden, oh, now I remember everything, So, we're going to be hitting 86 here pretty soon, and especially 87 and 88. There's going to be all kinds of stuff I'm going to talk about. And some of my favorite movies, we'll do some deep dives, or like we was talking about, Nightmare on Elm Street, we can talk about all of them in one hit. Talk about the George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead remake, or even, Diary of the Dead, and whatever that other one is that he made later on. They wasn't very Survival of the Dead, not very popular titles from his run. And we're going to be talking about some cartoons. We'll get into like Bozo the Clown, USA Cartoon Express, the toys of the time, or growing up, the soundtracks to movies. As you can tell, I don't know which way to move here. I got this old Fear Factory demanufacturer poster in the back. I believe my love of the hard rock, heavy metal come from movies. We'll get into a conversation about that because, Transformers the movie had that, that metal soundtrack. A lot of movies I like. We was talking about, Return of the Living Dead having that hard rock punk soundtrack. Trick or Treat, Fastway doing that soundtrack, with the Sammy Kerr, was that Blood Roses from the 80s, and then, popular stuff like Shocker, that had a cool soundtrack, and especially once we get into like the 90s. So, we get into Demon Knight and Airheads and, stuff like, I don't know, Reality Bites, Singles, the Crow soundtrack. We'll get into all that in future episodes. But like I've said before, be kind, rewind, and do not relieve yourself in any ashtrays that you may see. Till next time.